All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It is Thursday, September 26th of 2024. This is the SIG Network regular meeting. We are governed by the CNCF and Kubernetes Code of Conduct, which basically boils down to don't be a jerk. So please do that or don't do that. Let's get started. We've got some agenda today. Although it seems like it's mostly Antonio. We'll start with some triage. Everybody hear me? Nobody has said a word.
Yep, I hear you.
We hear you.
Oh, great. Thank you for the confirmation. Let me make sure I get the right window. Cool. All right. I've queued up the most recent untriaged bugs. As a reminder from previous sessions, if you were assigned a bug for triage, please take a look at it, see if we have enough information to confirm whether it is or is not a bug. If you sign up for triage, you are not expected to solve the bug. You're just here to find out if there's enough information that we can either accept it or close it, or get more information from the original reporter. So fresh up 5 hours ago, ingress doesn't work well for a namespace scenario. This came up in another context too. I think what it boils down to is ingress assumes that it can read ingress classes, which are a non-namespaced resource. And I think the answer is yes, that's correct. I'll answer this one because I have context from the other report. Unless anybody wants to talk about this issue, we can move on. It looks like people are installing their own private ingress in their own namespace and trying to figure out how to do that sanely while still using the ingress API. Okay, next issue. Net HTTP2 configurable server pings. Antonio, do you want to talk about this? No? Okay. It looks like a feature request. The question is, what do we need to do it? I'm inclined to triage accept this because it seems like a reasonable thing for us to do. It just needs somebody to work on it. Okay. DNS A record for pods with headless services may be delayed, wrong, and intermittently missing. I forget if we talked about this 2 weeks ago. We did talk about it 2 weeks ago. Local and non-natted traffic. Oh, Dan, you had pinned it down to possibly being a contract table fill. Okay, so no progress here. Maybe we can dedupe this with the other no track bugs and retitle it and accept it. Does someone want to try to clean up the docs on it? Otherwise, I can do it later. No volunteers? All right. I'll add myself. I think I'll add myself. There we go. Default NDOTs in kubelet. We talked about this last time too. I did respond and Sergey confirmed. We don't really want a kubelet flag here, so I'm going to go ahead and close this. Race conditioning kubelet kube proxy. I forget what this one was. We have issues. Publish not ready addresses. Okay, I didn't see the updates here. You can't use.
Ah,
Oh, Antonio's here. You're
yeah, I was here for 5 minutes and I didn't have sound, and I was saying, how quiet is the meeting today?
okay. I didn't read the updates on this one. Do you remember?
No, you scroll. I think they have an HA proxy for pod,
That's right.
and they still have the race that is when kubelet starts before kube proxy start before kubelet. They flip the state from not ready to ready, and that is disruptive. And what they say, okay, don't rely on services. If you are using already host network pods, use the host port feature on the pod. I mean, that will do the trick, right? Or a host network pod or a host port.
Yeah.
It's ugly, but the setup
Yeah.
is that's the problem, right? With the split brain. You see this with load balancer, right? When the load balancer has the control plane out to the APU server, then
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So it's active discussion. I will leave this one open for now. We have a couple of test fails.
yeah, well, this is an old one, right?
Is this closed now? Cops. There's been no responses, but
I need to check with Justin because I know that he changes something. I'm assigned to that. Okay, assign
yep.
to me, and I will follow up.
Yeah, he
With the cloud provider, external cloud provider thing, it's a mess. The way that the node can have three different names before. With the one that is the host name, the one that you pass in the flag as host name override, or the one that is assigned by the cloud provider. But since cloud provider external, you only have two, and there is some weird combinations that only we saw in the code people that the node doesn't match, and the test assume that the pod has to match, and it's a nightmare.
Yeah, all the host name, pod name, or host name, node name, VM name stuff is
Yeah,
a nightmare.
that is stuff. That is totally a wild west.
I tried once many years ago to have a node with a VM whose name was different than the node's name. Everything broke. Everything broke.
Well, and that's what's happened. And that convention is embedded in the E2E test. And then you don't know, oh, if I change the E2E test, or we need to change how the cloud
Well,
providers
I think
use
the E to
this
E
flag.
test is even what the machine thinks of as its own host name is embedded in there. Like I just tried to change the VM name.
Yeah, but
Anyway,
there is another problem is you remember there is another issue is the host name is the UTS namespace or something like that. And I think that Cryo and Containerd behave differently. So if you have a host network pod, in some of them you may inherit the host name, and others will use the one in the pod spec or something like that. I don't remember this.
okay. All right. Next fail was should preserve source IP. Status was.
No, this is the one that we
This is the
discussed.
same one. Yeah. Okay.
No, it's similar. It's because in theory, you can implement a service proxy and masquerade the source IP, right? But we have a test that validates that you don't masquerade because people want to keep the source IP. And
So this is
and
July. This is 2 months old now. What do we do with it?
this is the discussion that we wanted. I'm going to bring in a conference with Patrick and Ben and others. We want to bring these categories that you say, right? Conformance, highly recommended, or and
Ah, right. Yes.
Yeah, with different levels, right? It's because we cannot break and now say, oh, you cannot use this. At least say, okay, this is the recommended test that you should run.
Yes. Okay. Cool. Then I'll leave that sit for now. Last one, maybe. Allow load balancer source ranges for ingress. What do they want? I forget what this one was. For each port. Yeah, I don't think we're going to do this. Okay, 2 weeks, no response. All right, I'll stop here and I will turn over the floor to the agenda. Next on the agenda is Antonio talking about ingress class.
Okay, this is, I'm
The
lately,
issue that we talked about before.
you were talking about before.
Oh, you missed it? Sorry. Bug number 127657 was the first one we hit
The
in triage.
person just opened today the issue. I told him
Yep,
to
that's the
open
one.
because okay. Well, is that I mean, Rob Scott knows more than that, but what I feel is that there is a disconnection with Ingress communities and SIG Network. So I encourage all these people to come here and discuss. If something is wrong in the APIs or in the documentation, we can fix it. But if everybody goes in their own trying to solve the problem, we are not solving anything.
Yeah, I think so. One of my thoughts here on the idea of ingress class is ingress class, unfortunately, makes, if an ingress controller requires ingress class, then they require the person installing that ingress controller to have cluster-wide access because it's a cluster scope resource. That sounds fine on the surface, but keep in mind the other thing that we're telling ingress controller authors right now. We're saying ingress controllers are very hard to make safe in a multi-tenant environment. So you should deploy you should configure, you should call it, make it clear that your ingress controller can only support a single tenant safely. What does that mean? That ingress controller should probably be deployed within a single namespace and only be able to see or act on things within that single namespace. That seems to contradict the whole existence of ingress class for those controllers that struggle with multi-tenancy. So I feel like we should do a better job of communicating that ingress class is indeed optional and maybe standardize on a path for how implementations can work without ingress class. That's where I would go with this.
So I'm fine with saying it works without ingress class. And I mean, the implication there is you get whatever the defaults are, right? What I'm disconnected on is even if you install one per tenant, one per namespace, right? That sort of pathologically you get to one per namespace. That doesn't mean you need your own classes per namespace. It just means that you have to have a concept of a class that your cluster administrator is happy with, right?
Yeah.
Because the split was the design of ingress was the cluster provider decides what modes of ingress are allowed in this cluster, and it describes them via classes, and then it offers the implementations. So like running an ingress controller per namespace doesn't necessarily mean the person who owns the namespace is running the ingress, right? You can imagine a class that was the super cheap and unsafe class, which says you're all going to share a proxy, like, and that's the unsafe version. And then there's the slightly less cheap version, but much safer, which runs one per tenant, but we'll run it for you. Like my ingress controller will spawn a deployment in your namespace for you, or just spawn a deployment in some namespace. It doesn't have to be in yours. It'll spawn it in some administrative namespace, but that proxy is for you only, right? And anytime I see an ingress from your namespace, I'll attach it to that proxy. And then you can run down the spectrum all the way to where like the cloud providers are, which is like you create an ingress in your namespace and you get a dedicated cloud load balancer with its own IP address that is just for you. And that's the sort of least cheap and most safe option.
Yep.
And none of that requires you to have a class in a namespace.
Yeah, no,
I understand the desire to, if you know, I want to run Nginx ingress myself and I want to configure it myself in my own namespace. Is the ingress API actually doing anything for you at that point? Why not just configure
Yes.
Nginx?
Yes, it absolutely is, because you think about it, ingress is a nice convenience. All that ingress is really doing, well, we'll talk about the class of ingress in-cluster ingress providers. They are creating a service type load balancer and throwing some L7 routing behind it, right? Most people inside a namespace can already spin up a service type load balancer. Ingress is adding some nice L7 routing behind that in a fairly consistent portable way. The same could be said with Gateway API as well, where we've had the same issue and discussion. So very, very familiar with it. And I think we do need to allow and encourage single namespace implementations to exist. I would say it gets much murkier. I don't really have any strong desire to support multi-namespace implementations that aren't just cluster scoped, right? Like if you're deploying something that can reach into multiple namespaces, you should probably just have, you know, the ingress class, gateway class, whatever resource as part of that. But if you're operating entirely within a single namespace, I'd like to make that work.
Is it too imposing to say you don't get to use class? Like, sorry, class doesn't work. If you're using ingress Nginx, write your own CRD that is a namespace, you know, ingress Nginx class. And if you need to configure it via class, that's how you do it. Or just configure it via the flags that you give it, since you're running it in your own namespace. Like,
yeah, I think the ones I've done so far is configured via flag. That's fine. What we've also discussed in Gateway is some kind of central registry where implementations can reserve a class name, where if a class is not specified or if they are operating in a namespace local mode only, then they will just implement all ingresses of that class within the scope that they can see. So just kind of reserve.
Do we require ingress class? I forget. Is that
no?
required?
It's completely optional.
Okay. And did we do a default ingress class? Like, did we do that admission control trick? No. Okay, so go ahead, Antonio.
The only annoyance with the class is the migration from annotation to class. If you have that's what the person in the chat was reporting, that there is a warning or something. You have an annotation but don't have a class, or I don't remember.
So the specific because we added this to an API that was already effectively stable, we couldn't add a new required field. The only validation that's meaningful here is you can't set the annotation and the field at the same time. So there was an ingress class annotation. There's a new field. They can't both be set at the same time. That's the only real validation here. But you could leave them both empty.
Okay. So is there something to do here?
I'm not overflowing with time, but if anyone wanted to document or help document that a single namespace ingress controller is both allowed and maybe even recommended in some cases, particularly if those controllers struggle with multi-tenancy, that would be useful.
Okay. I've already assigned myself this bug. I don't mind writing up some of what we're talking about here and then seeing if that satisfies the original poster. It's unclear to me what action they want out of this.
I asked him in the chat, and I think that just documentation or guidance for the implementation
Okay.
Should be enough.
Where would we put permanent documentation? Like, do we have an
Maybe
ingress page
this
on
is
the?
we do, but I think the API field.
Okay, I could see some of this there. I feel like there's going to be more than we want to stick in just the API docs, but
Yeah, well, that's. But I mean, I think that this has a long way, but at least as a starting point.
all right. Well, let me write a comment on that issue, and we can refine the comment together, and then see if we want to stick it in the API docs or something. Fair? All right. Next on the agenda then is also Antonio, DRA stuff.
Oh, I changed my desktop and I don't find it. Which one? The status thing? This
DRA,
is
yeah, network status and
yeah,
endpoint.
yeah. I don't know if John is here, John Belomaric and Lionel. So there is this new cap for the multi-network discussions. We say that we wanted to try the array, and both Lionel and I put some demos and code showing feasibility, and it works, and the scheduling works, but we are still missing the feedback loop from the driver, right? And Lionel was kindly working on a cap that is already for review. So if people can review, I think that it's pretty neat and target and aligned with what John suggested in the beginning of the array, but we need that reviews and what is missing, and I'm trying to merge it in 132. John and Lionel, I don't know if they are here, if they want to talk about this.
This is number, that's a pull request. Sorry. Which cap is this? Is it on our cap dashboard? 4817? Is it a?
It's a
Who
SIG
owns-
network cap, but its SIG network is at least is involved, right? So we have the idea is that you can, when the driver allocates a device, it can write some status back, and the primary use case for that, beyond just troubleshooting, like, oh, this thing didn't work for some reason, is for network drivers to write back results of their network interface allocation. So like what the OS name for the interface is, what the IP address is, what the MAC address is, whatever else information. So the big thing that SIG Network needs to do is figure out what that data structure looks like for the networking team. And Tim, for you as API reviewer, there's a question about whether this is a one of completely or it's a set of optional fields. And the reason set of optional fields might be useful is for devices that serve multiple functions, whereas networking or whatever is just one of their functions. Then a one of might be overly prescriptive.
Okay. I will put it in the hopper of caps I need to read. I will see what I can do. Other people, please.
This is our simplest DRA one, by the way, Tim. So.
Dude, I hear you. Somebody in their infinite wisdom decided that it was a good time to put Google's performance review process right at the end of the cap window. So all of us in Google land are buried right now. Okay. Next topic was Lionel and Mache about the service label for endpoint slice controller.
Yeah, I just want to, I saw the comments. You pushed back and said, let's take a breather. I think that was a week ago or so. And I do wanted to get it in 150 in the next release. So.
Well, what I really meant was, like, let's not go approving the PR until we have some discussion and some consensus around it.
Sure.
Do you want to give the recap?
Say again?
You want to give the recap for the group?
So I think Lionel is here. You own this. Go ahead.
Yes. So the idea is to have a label on the service which will disable the endpoint slice controller for that particular service. It's a bit like the service proxy label, if anyone knows about it, that will disable the service to be running inside kubeproxy. So here, the idea is to have another implementation of the endpoint slice controller that could, for example, select secondary IPs, so we can run services on top of secondary networks. That would be the main use case. So the idea is just disable endpoint slice when the label is on the service.
So the pushback was, at least in part from me, we have a way of extending service to, manually selected, externally selected endpoints, which is don't specify a selector, and then that means the built-in controllers are deactivated and you can do what you want. The argument, just to recap for the recording, the argument was, but we want the selector. The selector is actually correct. We want to select pods, but we don't want the standard IP field to be used. We want a different field or different information to be used in the endpoint slice. Is that the right assessment?
Perfect.
Okay.
Yes.
I see a hand with Rob.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've probably already left some comments on the cap. I understand the hesitation. To be clear, I know that when we open up a window like this, it's very hard to take it back. The service proxy name thing that's being used as a reference point here, I get that may not have been ideal to begin with. And now that we open that can of worms, there's another related can of worms that is pointing to that as prior art. So I get that whole argument of like, maybe we shouldn't have done anything like this to begin with. With that said, we put a lot of thought into this with the endpoint slice API. There is very intentionally a managed by label that is on every endpoint slice that is created by a controller that describes which controller owned that endpoint slice. So far, there are 2 endpoint slice controllers in tree. One mirrors custom endpoints to endpoint slices, and the other is the primary one. I would love to see the endpoint slice ecosystem evolve so that there are other controllers. And if you're thinking of ways to differentiate, sure, you could try and be more performant or provide better hints. But I also think it's useful to get different data, right? So the idea of I want to select a different IP from this pod seems in line with what I imagined, at least, for how custom endpoint slice controllers would evolve over time. I do get, all the reasons to be very careful here because it's, once you open the door, it's very hard to go back. It's a one-way thing. But yeah, that's all. I do support this cap, but I do understand why some would be hesitant.
You said an important word there. Select one of the addresses. I mean, we will have pods, of course, with many addresses, and then the endpoints need to be able to. It's the same it's the same thing. It just had different IP endpoints. So, what is the endpoint? Is it the address or is it the pod? And I think that is part of it. I would prefer it to be the pod, and then it just has many addresses, and you pick one. I mean, the one that suits you. For the purpose, and that could be depending on which network you're connecting over or what protocol you're using or anything really.
John?
So prefacing this with the big caveat that I haven't looked at this cap, but and I just happen to be here, but I will render an opinion anyway, which you feel free to ignore. It sounds to me like this is basically right, that the API is underspecified at this point, right? And it's exactly what Per just said, like, right? It's the API is for the pod, but what we only had one address field on that, so that's what it did before. But now maybe we need an additional field to specify which address off of that pod. So is that, or addresses? So is that simply a additional API, which I don't know, from an API extension point of view, might be weird because you have a default value. And anyway, so to me, it sounds like a new field rather than a label telling something to ignore it. It's a new field that needs to be interpreted. I see Matt just laughing. Probably this is not the first time this has been suggested.
No, because you're suggesting adding field to a service, and I see team is crunching there, expanding. So yeah, that's why I'm laughing.
I mean, like I want to. I think it's worth looking at this problem from different perspectives. So, what is an endpoint or an endpoint slice? It's the result of a query that says, for each service, select all the pods that match the service and extract some port information that matches some service information, right? It's basically a fancy query with a where clause. So what I'm hearing described is, well, we want to change the where clause. We want to change the last piece of that, which extracts information from the pod, right?
You want to change the select list, not the where clause. You want the same pods.
Yes, you're right. You're right. You're right.
Selector.
Yes, thank you. You're right. And if we think about it from that perspective, does it give us any different insights? Like, hypothetically, I'm not saying we should do this, but hypothetically, if we added a cell expression that said, I'm going to evaluate this expression for every pod that matches the selector, and the result of this cell expression is what I'm going to use as the IP addresses for this pod, right? Now, the standard cell expression would simply be extract the status pod IPs, right, and return that. But crazy people could do crazy things with it, and they could write a weirdo cell expression that extracts a different network or inverts the octets or whatever you want to do with it, right? Would that be a satisfactory result, or is it, well, no, actually we want to also do something else? Because there were some words buried in the KEP that made me worried that there's more than just that. Lionel?
So to go back to the previous KEP, the idea is to report the IPs in another object, this resource claim. Is it possible from this CEL to get the IPs where that are attached to this port, that are stored in another?
So this is coming to the previous KEP that Lionel is driving as well.
Yeah.
We want to add the status to, and what John was saying, since we cannot add stuff into pod team, okay, we're looking alternatives. So now, okay, maybe the client can hold the status, and let's not look at pod, or pod will be having the selectors, and then we're gonna go to the claim or any other object, whatever it is. So we are, keep in mind, team, that was the idea initially when we talked back in January. We want to change the pod spec, but since we want to not do that, and we are going to alternatives, we want to go to alternatives, right? That's where the consequences going on, right? We need to now open up some of the core for us to do those external things, right? Like, that's where we are coming from as well for this.
Yeah, and so that's a good point. So and just to answer Lionel's question directly, yes, you can load the cell context in the evaluation with the pod and the associated resource claims, and so you can navigate the tree. It's a little ugly because like cell is, it's like, what if it's not there, and you would try to reference it, and like, so you have to, like, you get an ugly expression, maybe we'd have to look at that. But yes, you should be able to navigate the tree and find the addresses you're interested in. And if there's like, oh, there's an IP address and there's some other protocol address, you could actually differentiate. You could do quite a lot, actually, if you think about it from, like Tim was saying, like, it's basically in a SQL query, your select clause, you can do a lot there, especially, yeah. Anyway, so I think that would work, what Tim has said. It's just whether it's what we want. Well, it would work from what I'm hearing of what people want.
I also, well, there's a couple things. One, I'm not actually suggesting it. I have no idea what the performance implications of that would be. right? Like Cell is not, it's not particularly slow, but it's also not as fast as native code. So, you know, doing that for every endpoint slice would probably be a disaster, and we would need to have like a baked in default and then some way to override it, and we'd have to figure out with scalability what the like that. That's a it's a big
the equivalent though is like field paths, right? You could use field paths instead of Cell, right? Like,
yeah,
but it gets harder to navigate a complex tree.
I mean, for a sufficiently complicated field path, you're inventing Cell. Like you have to write a grammar parser, right? Anyway, that's one way to look at it. If we were to feed it both the pod and the claims context, that's even more complicated because like we don't currently have claims in the endpoint slice controller. So we will be adding a whole new can of worms to figure that out. Although, you know, maybe it's not terrible. I apologize. I don't remember why we said we can't change pod spec. You know, I'm not re-adjudicating myself, but I would like to refresh on why we decided that. I'm going to have to go back and read this KEP that was just raised. Per, you're mute if you're talking.
Now I'm not muted anymore. No, so I live in a world where the address of pods change, and the address added, their networks added, and so on. So the endpoint today, the way it's set up, seems very much that sort of the IP is an identifier that can be used to or used as an identifier that it's set and it doesn't change. Like I said, I live in a world where v6 addresses are added or removed automatically due to time constraint and other things, and networks can be added, and then things change. So what are you looking up? Then it's more like I'm looking for the pod, and then as a secondary action, actually I look for the addresses and sort of see if they match the network, so on and so on. So yes, different requirements leads to different sort of ideas on what an endpoint is and how it should be used. And the question then is like, how do you write a controller that's more slated to work in an environment where IP addresses are not tied to the lifetime of the pod?
Yes. I'm trying to figure out how we can enable people to do things that we didn't plan for without carrying too much baggage.
I understand it. I haven't come up with a good way of doing it. I would have sort of told them.
I think
so.
Yeah, and this is where what I think Rob mentions, right? That's why that's why when he created, I'm not sure whether Rob you did or the endpoint slice has the managed by, right? Because this is where the whole idea comes from, right? Endpoint slice had and creates the managed by flag. If that one is different from mine, okay, I don't touch it, right?
Yeah.
So this is where we
But
want to do the same.
The assumption was if you're writing an endpoint slice that has come from somewhere else, right? Then that's cool. I don't know where the somewhere else is. I shouldn't know where the somewhere else is. That's a you problem. You go and express that. And the problem here is it's so close to a standard pod selector that there's the desire to not replicate that logic. Like, why would I take the pod selector and say, leave that blank or specify something you know will never match, and then go do the same thing in an annotation instead, right? I get why that's distasteful. I do. And at the same time, if you were selecting something that wasn't a pod, you'd have to do that.
But right? I think you already answered. It's performance. These things must be performant, otherwise it makes no sense. I mean,
not only that,
I think a really large cluster. I mean, what is the create and delete frequency of pods? I mean, if you have a large cluster, it's large.
It is, although
so
there tends to be
optimize for speed for lookup, right, and for updates.
Certainly, we've heard of people who'd have thousands or many thousands of endpoints behind services, but that's not the norm. For most people who have huge churn, they're like batch workloads, right? They can do tens or hundreds of pods per second, but those aren't behind services, so we're not generally updating endpoint slices.
That's true.
For those.
So the other aspect is as well reusability, team, and maintenance, right? Because right now, why would I forgo all the blows and whistles that are being added to the endpoint/controller? Well, if you say I go with the JSON path, I have to now tweak even more to kind of support look at that, and maybe okay, maybe there is some path to do something around that one where I can reuse the library, but I think it's just more work. Okay. What I'm getting at is to be able to reuse the code since endpoint/controller is now a library, right? Is a standalone library. You can pull it in and create your own out of that, right?
You can still use that. It's just a matter of where
sure.
does your selector input come from? Does it come from a field named selector, or does it come from an annotation?
Okay, fair.
There was some sort of hand waving. Maybe it was in the comments of the KEP that was like, well, what if the selector wasn't selecting pods? And that worries me too. Like, is that a norm that we want to establish? Are we okay with that?
But then, why would that be a problem? Maybe I will ask that. If someone has such use case and implementation, why would that be a problem? If that doesn't touch on core, someone has created a cluster in such implementation, why would that be a problem?
If the endpoint slice is in the cluster, I mean, we had a regression like 2 weeks ago because people used to still using endpoints, and we have a weird case. So don't underestimate the inertia of everything that is consuming endpoints and endpoint slices. So everything that is generated within the cluster is a surface that we need to maintain. So
but then the endpoint slice, but then such endpoint slice will be, you will straight away see, oh, it's managed by your implementation. Why are you coming to us? I'm not sure why that's a concern.
I'm not sure it's a concern. Like, nothing stops you today from writing a service that has no selector and then writing your own endpoint slice filled with garbage, right? I mean, we validate that the garbage sort of tastes like an IP address, but other than that, we don't do any validation. We don't prove that it's reachable or that it's on the same network, right?
It's APIs, right?
So, in theory, this problem already exists. You could put the IP address of any damn thing you want. It's a VM on your network somewhere. It's a physical host. It's google.com's DNS resolution today, whatever you want. I don't know if anybody does that.
Sure.
One of the I think interesting uses of endpoint slice as an extension mechanism is the multi-cluster services stuff, right? Where people get to write an IP address that may or may not actually be a pod. It might be a load balancer in front of a pod in another cluster. And I think that's a really interesting example of using endpoint slice with a service with no selector, right? I don't think that would be better for using selector. Like, it wouldn't make sense. So maybe not germane here. That said, if we followed current conventions, we would have named the field pod selector. So, if your pod selector is selecting something that's not pods, that's, a smell. So maybe the argument would be that the current convention is wrong and over specific, but that's where it is. I see we're coming up on the last 10 minutes. We don't have an answer here. I'm still chewing on this, trying to think of how we could write this in a way that isn't just disable the endpoint slice like as an annotation, right? Or I mean, that's effectively what we're describing here. It feels very specific and very prescriptive, and it feels like something that we're likely to regret later, right? And I'm trying to see if there's a better way.
There is an alternative. Just disable the endpoint slice controller in the queue controller manager and run your own.
But that means you disable it for everybody, for the entire cluster. Like, it's a very large granularity decision.
Yeah, but the use case is just that. All the use cases that are laid out in here is I want to own the whole cluster networking. I want to create my own services, my own what's the name, network tenants and all the stuff. It's just exactly what the problem is, that we are seeing this in pieces, but the whole thing is what was in the original KEP, right? Is compartmentalize and everything. And the thing that I don't like is that we start putting small pieces in instead of that we don't know if we are going to regret. Imagine that we land this, and after 3 releases, oh, something happens, and well, we just don't want this way of doing. What do we do? That's my main concern is this: is if this ends in 2 implementations, 1 implementation that never come back, we end with something that is there forever, and what do we do?
Yeah.
So the problem here is with the disabling of the core means you change your infrastructure. Think GKE now. You're right. I will implement your idea in GKE. I have all the clusters coming in where now
Yeah.
all the base pods are done by the new controller, where I did what you
Yeah,
suggested, right?
I was going to
That's-
say, Antonio, that would probably result in way more divergence, right?
Yeah.
Because now like an entire standardized component is disabled.
But let's put this into proportions, right? We are talking here about 2, 3 flavors, right? We are talking the magnitude of the change is and the impact is bigger than the whole landscape that is going to use this feature. I wouldn't say. The thing is, who is damaging who?
I think we should take a look to see. It seems like there's a use case, right? Which is already supported in a way where you have a no selector, right? People can write custom. So that exists. It's more that is the selector, unfortunately, is not just like a string, right? It's like actually a kind of complicated object. And we do know the awkwardness of how to specify it in an annotation, for instance, if you wanted to stuff it somewhere where you didn't need to kind of change the API. And we would like, for most things, for people to use the standardized implementation. So I don't necessarily see it. I don't know what the correct solution is, but I don't necessarily see it as like the solution is just to completely opt out of like a big slice of the infrastructure.
Well, I'll maybe take it even a step further, Bowie. Is the solution to opt out of this one particular slice, which is very specific to how the system works today, or is the solution actually bigger to say, yeah, this is a service, but it's not a normal service. It's a different class of service. We have avoided having service classes because, oh my God, I don't really want to deal with that. But isn't that kind of what we're describing?
The mention of classes and then the fact that we have inheritance from like cluster IP to node.
And we already actually have we have load balancer class, right? So
I know.
There's already a way to specify I have a service, but I want a different kind of load balancer. But I mean, are we describing a different class here?
I mean, it's like a different control. It's like old ingress controller, ingress class, right? It's like you have.
I do think like if we want to entertain that, we would need to make sure the cure is not like more extreme than the.
Well,
than the pain.
I mean, I'll go back to my favorite topic. Like, should this be solved with gateway instead of service? If we had gateways that could have cluster IPs, if only there was an API to allocate a cluster IP, oh, there is, then would this be better described as a gateway, which used a cluster IP, which had a different policy or something to its backend selection?
That always was a long-term idea, but the problem here is, I think that takes time. This is something that short-term, and this is where I'm probably shooting myself in the foot, but this is something that can be done immediately, and we can go and do that. What you are describing is the problem is gateway L4 isn't there. Gateway client IP, I'm not sure, Rob, from what I last time heard, that's completely not even started talking. This is not.
Yeah, no, I mean, we all want to see that happen. So
Yes.
if anyone wants to volunteer, I'll support them.
Yes. So that's I know this is a topic that definitely has to be finally driven, but I think this is just a low-hanging fruit. We are thinking we can get a win and be enabled.
You're right. You're right. You're shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah.
Like I love low-hanging fruit. They're very tasty when you're starving. But you know, the good stuff's way at the top of the tree, and it's worth the climb if you can afford to do it. Usually. I mean, the reality is this is a small-ish code change. And it happens relatively early in the life cycle of stuff. So like if you hit this, just you deactivate one whole branch of logic and you go on with our life, right? And it becomes somebody else's problem. So, you know, I'm okay with making things other people's problems, as Rob can attest to. But I'm still not sure it's something we want to carry around forever, especially if there are unpleasant but viable workarounds, and we know what we would really want. I'm not saying we do, but if we came up with a design that wasn't this, like, hey, you should totally use L4 gateway except it doesn't exist, then I'm really more inclined to say, yeah, you can hold your nose and stick your selector in the YAML or in the annotations, or you know, you could come work on the gateway, cluster IP gateways. Rob will support you. Great way for somebody to earn their approver stripes.
Is this L4 gateway will really exist at the end? Because we always, from what I could see and experience, it was always like the service has a backend and then you have the routes that just route traffic towards the services. I made a talk about that.
It's a really confusing part of service. Service is overloaded as it serves as both front end and back end. I think especially within Gateway API, we'd like to view it as a back end only and not the front end part of it. But you're right that in the current world that is very confusing.
But here, so I'm confused. But here we would want to replace the backend.
Yes, you would not use a service as the backend. You would use
exactly.
You'd put a selector into one of the gateway resources. Yeah, either into the route or into the, like, maybe this is the argument for finally having a single embedded route within a gateway resource or something. Like we have to think about the UX there. But yes, at the end you point to a selector, not to a service.
I can already do that, right? Like the service is L3 and L4 route. You specify in which gateway this service is running with this with the service proxy label. We specify in which gateway the service is running, and then the route is done via the ports and the cluster IP, and then the load balancing is done by the service. So this object is more or less already existing if we want with the service. Just it will be like a very similar object that will be just replacing service that will be more integrated with Gateway API, I guess.
Yeah, the real advantage is all the things it would not have, right? Which is all the baggage that service brings with it, which is the reason that I get so terrified whenever anybody wants to change anything in service, because I don't think we have none of us are smart enough to reason about how it's going to affect every other aspect of service. Rob says he's dropping off. Keep going on Slack. Yes, we're at time. Thank you. That reminds me. This is a really interesting topic. I'm not saying no to it at this point. I know that there's a press to try to get this approved for the KEP window, which is in like 2 weeks. And also I have to deal with performance reviews. I will try to make time to bring this back. I'm not optimistic that it will make this release, given the time frame and the contention around it. I just want to be realistic and manage expectations. I know it feels simple, but the implications are pretty big. I see Dan. I haven't heard anything from Dan Winship. Is he here today? No, I don't see him on the list.
He was traveling this week.
Okay. You know, it's not, I alone am not the person who needs to maintain these subsystems, right? Everybody, Dan, Antonio are part of this decision. So let's keep the conversation going on the KEP. This was useful. Gave me some stuff to think about, especially that last point. You know, thanks for that. No, I mean it for real. We're at time, so I'll wrap up here and I'll stop the recording. Thank you, everybody. We will talk to you in 2 weeks. Don't forget, KubeCon is a scant like 5 or 6 weeks away. So we'll see you. Hopefully, we'll see a lot of you there. Go ahead and stop the recording if I can remember where they put it. Record, stop.